Hello, everyone. My guest today is Robin Hanson, an economist at George Mason University, longtime writer at Overcoming Bias, the author of The Age of M, and co-author of The Elephant in the Brain. Oh, nice. So I guess before we dive into the book, I know you've studied so many different areas, and I'm just wondering, instead of just academically what motivates people in general, what motivates you? Is there any driving question or passion that's been motivating you all along?
Well, I'm just driven by trying to understand the world, but focused on whatever is most important. And my main intellectual strategy is to look for what's important and neglected, where I can find some sort of angle to make progress, some unusual angle. And that's what I continue to do. So I'm opportunistic in that way. Like the last day or so, I've been thinking about the origin of modernism as due to youth movements and trying to think about how that helps us understand the nature of cultural change over the last few centuries. So that's where my head's, because I see that as important and neglected, where I have an angle.
So is it neglected areas, or is it areas that you think you could have a positive impact? Would you be interested in a neglected area that has no practical relevance?
Right. It's a combination of important and neglected. If it's not important, there's not that much interest in it being neglected. There has to be a value to it, something that matters, some consequence.
I saw you had a post yesterday how it discussed certain areas maybe emphasize rationalism a little bit more, like engineering and finance, and that maybe journalism and academia also strive to do that. Do you think that within specific areas of academia, ones you have experience with, some of them maybe are more rational or encourage more rationalism than other areas?
I think you definitely see a variation in how truth-oriented they are or how much progress they're making. I don't know if you can correlate that very well with other things. I think it most likely just is a random feature of who happens to be in charge and has been in charge for the last generation of particular areas.
I know you have a background that's more technical, but you've shifted, not that it's not technical at all, but more to the social sciences. So is that an area that maybe you felt you could have a bigger impact in, or just that it was
I think I got tricked, or I tricked myself. So in physics and then computer science, I noticed that people tried very hard to find innovations, to find better ways of doing things, and that there was a lot of money and prestige at stake for doing so. And then when I started to dabble in social science, it seemed to me that it was relatively easy to find innovations and improvements that were possible in social institutions. And so I thought, oh, wow, this is just as important, but apparently I'm really good at it. What I didn't realize is that, in fact, in social science, we just have a long history of big, promising ideas just sitting there and not being tried. So it's not actually that hard to find big, promising institution change ideas in social sciences, because the world just doesn't actually do much with them, and they're not very interested in finding them, therefore. And so that means I can find original ideas there, ones that nobody has ever found, but it's not because they're that hard to find. Apparently, it's because nobody cares. Because if you do find them and you go tell everybody about them, they go yawn and they're not interested. So I kind of tricked myself that way, switching into social science for that. But now it still might be that social science was my best place in the world to make a contribution, but I was a little fooled.
So the ideas are there for, the discovery and potentially to have the big positive impact. It's just changing the world is hard.
Well, the world's not interested in translating ideas that, if applied, would have a big impact into actual practical application that would realize that impact.
Okay, the main part of this is to focus on the elephant in the brain. I know it came out many years ago, but I feel like there's still so much to discuss about it. So maybe just before we get started, can you maybe summarize the thesis of the book overall?
Sure. So I was a social scientist for many years, and over time as an economist in particular, I noticed many puzzles that many other people have noticed about social behavior, many ways in which our simple theories of social behavior don't fit the patterns in detail of how people behave. And I realized that you could make progress and make more sense of this behavior if you would just be willing to consider a wider range of motivations for this behavior. So in most of these literatures, most people have a standard thing they say about what they're trying to do in those areas. Like you go to the doctor to get well, you go to school to learn, you give to charity to help people who, you're less fortunate than you. These are the things people say about that. And then most social science tries to understand those behaviors in terms of the motivations that people say. And then if you're willing to consider that maybe they're just wrong about their motivations, a lot of the puzzles can be less puzzling, can make more sense. And that's the point of the book, is to say, well, just consider that we might be wrong about our motivations. And that makes sense of this behavior. Now that creates the meta puzzle of why are we wrong? Why don't we know our motivations? We discuss that at the end of the book. But the very basic point is a lot of familiar to social scientists puzzles in behavior make a lot more sense if you just assume we're not being entirely honest with ourselves about our motivations.
So even if people's motivations aren't as simple as they seem, and
Well,
people
they're
could
actually
be
pretty
very-
simple. Their real motivations are no less simple than the motivations they claim to have. It's not about simplicity.
Right. Even if they're not they're not exactly as claimed. How do we know what they are actually? Because it could be there's all these complicated factors. So how do we know what their true motives are? Or
Well, right. So the point in empirical science and science in general is to try to take plausible theories on one hand and correlates of facts on the other hand and match them together. That's, in some sense, the generic science method, the generic method of inquiry into abstract questions. So here the task is to take particular areas of like say medicine or education or charity, as we mentioned, and collect patterns in those areas, collect correlations, structures of what happens with what. And that's the data you're trying to explain. And then on the other side of the equation, you have the different theories that purport to explain that data. And you just go one by one asking for each theory, how much of that data does it explain? Well, how many of these correlations does it account for naturally, simply, without too much extra, needing for making special pleas about things to explain that data. And you just go through these explanations, and whichever one seems to fit better would then be the strongest explanation. But they could all be contributing to some degree. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, but still you're asking, what's the strongest explanation of this data? It would be whatever the simple theory predicts these patterns you see in behavior. That's how you do all science making sense of the world.
so maybe it would help to go through some examples. I know you cover in the book a whole range of different examples, so maybe we could just pick a few to go through. Some of them, to me, felt more controversial, some of them less controversial. So maybe
Which would you like to start with, the more or the less controversial?
Let's start with the most controversial,
Okay.
at least in my opinion. Let's start with health.
Sure, medicine.
Medicine, yes.
So the whole point is medicine isn't about health.
Right, okay.
Right. So you call it health, invoking the usual story about what the standard motive there is. And then it's not plausibly about health, is our better, we say, explanation for the behavior there.
Okay, so I think you pointed out that increasing spending, it doesn't necessarily provide at least measurable benefits to people's health. So that points to some flaw. Assuming that's true.
Well, let's just be clear. You went over that really fast. Let's just make sure our listeners understand what the claim there is. When you take groups of thousands of people and you split them randomly into parts, and for some of those parts, you induce them to spend more on medicine compared to the other parts, typically by lowering the price that they face for medicine, then you see that they do, in fact, consume more medicine because they face a lower price. And then you look at their health and you don't see a difference in health. That's the key story here. So this is about the effect of the extra medicine that some people got that other people didn't, induced by a lower price. And there are other datas on variations in groups in medicine. For example, we have different regions, and some regions they do more medicine than others. We also have data on, say, different kinds of treatments. Some treatments are sort of more solid in terms of the evidence for them versus not. We also have big hospitals versus small hospitals. Big hospitals just tend to do a wider range of kinds of treatments compared to small hospitals. In all these data sets, what you see is that the group who consumes more medicine doesn't actually get healthier. But most of those other data sets aren't randomized experiments. And so people go, well, I'm not sure I trust that because, hey, there could be other things going on. That's why the randomized experiments are so potent as evidence. And that's why we focus on that. But we do have other kinds of evidence that is consistent with it.
So we do see, like, assuming there isn't some hidden way it's making them better that doesn't show up in the results, that in these cases, it doesn't help for them to spend more. Or maybe they're not, being completely rational in how they pick between different options. But maybe it just is people aren't fully rational. It's not that they're just trying to signal, that they care or something like that. They're just not fully rational in making decisions.
Well, we have lots of other industries and areas of life where people are also presumably not fully rational. And yet we see a difference. For example, if you eat more calories, you get fat. You don't have to be rational about how many calories you eat to have that happen, right? If you have more heating in your building, you're not as cold. You don't have to be rational about how much heating you get in your building for that to be true. We do definitely see other areas of life where there's a consequence, a measurable consequence of getting more of something for other things you say you care about. I mean, people do say they care about, like, getting enough food to not wither away to nothing. They say they care about how warm they are in their apartment. And then we look at and see a connection. Now, that doesn't mean they're honest about their motives there. It could be that they eat for other reasons or use heating for other reasons than they say, but we do definitely see a connection there.
Right, but it could be that, let's say here, they think if they spend more, they will get a better health outcome, and that it's not in any way trying to show that they care. They really sincerely believe it, and it just maybe doesn't actually lead to the better outcome. But it doesn't mean, like, to me, like, surviving and things related to that seem like such a basic human, like, drive. So it seems maybe that that's still what's motivating it more than just trying to show that they care.
So once we're willing to add to a theory randomness of the form that, people's intentions are just not connected to their outcomes, it becomes pretty easy to explain pretty much any data set of any behavior whatsoever, right? So when we're trying to explain data sets, we do need to penalize a model the more it needs to invoke random events and factors to account for the data. Our standard ways of modeling the relationship between data and theory, Bayesian epistemology, says that you should favor the theories that can more naturally explain the data without needing to invoke randomness. Now, all theories are going to need to invoke some randomness to explain data. That is, we almost never see theory that perfectly accounts for the data without any randomness. So it's not that we aren't going to be forced to invoke randomness at some point in some way, but we are trying to minimize our appeal to randomness in our explanation of data. That's the whole point.
So I guess the question is, if they really know that it's not helping them, like, is that something that other people know? Because then it would also affect the signaling status of showing that they care.
So you said really know. So what I've said so far is, what is the underlying motive? But it's not clear you really know your underlying motive. That's the point. So the idea would be, when we look at a set of behaviors, the motives that best explain the behaviors are the motives that account for the details of those behaviors. If you say you're planning to, take a trip to San Francisco, and you pack your bag and you buy a plane ticket and you get up at the right time of day, that we're starting to see that there's a pattern of your behavior that fits this goal of going to San Francisco. And you might fail. You might go to the wrong airport, for example, as I've sometimes done, get up on the wrong day, have bought a ticket to the wrong airport. You can make mistakes, but we're going to be looking for the mapping between the details of your behavior and the supposed motive. Now, you could, in fact, achieve goals through motives without being consciously aware of that. So that's, in fact, what we're suggesting in our book, is that people in their head are telling themselves a different story about their behavior than the one that explains the behavior. So that means somewhere inside them, there is something that roughly knows what they're trying to do, because it's the one that's setting up these patterns and making sure they correspond with the motive. But that doesn't mean their conscious minds are very aware of that. So it's about where in their head do they know?
Right. But in this case, if all this extra spending and all these aspects of medicine don't really help, then why do people feel that it shows that they care? It doesn't really help anyways. It seems like nobody's aware that these things don't help.
Well, in standard models of signaling, it's about the cost you incur less than the benefit that's achieved that tends to signal the willingness to sacrifice. For example, in ancient societies did human sacrifices, we could be quite skeptical about whether their sacrifices achieved the purposes they declared, i.e. to make sure the sun still went around the sky, because that's what the Aztecs said they were doing the sacrifices for, to make sure the heavens still kept moving. But we could still see the sacrifices as a signal of some substantial concern and, willingness to sacrifice for something near the eye. Right? We might not be sure what exactly was driving this, but the fact that they were willing to make these sacrifices is showing there's something substantial they were eager to achieve or to show.
Okay, I guess taking a step back maybe from just being focused on medicine, if you had to overall put an estimate on how much of human actions and the things driving them is related to signaling and to status, what percentage would it be?
So you just introduced signaling and status, but in this conversation, the rest of our audience hasn't heard. So the point's going to be, when we look at many explanations of behavior, it'll turn out in medicine and elsewhere that a big part of what we're doing is showing off characteristics of ourselves. For example, medicine, we are showing off our loyalty and concern for particular people. So we show loyalty by spending a lot on our associates' medicine, including our time as well as money and attention. And people do take that as a signal of such things. That is, we can see both that people put in the effort. We can also look at how other people interpret the effort. And people definitely do seem to interpret putting time and energy and attention into medical care for their associates as a sign of concern and care for those people. Often what we want to show off isn't so much loyalty as things that are impressive about us, and that's more closely related to status. Status is just a name for all the different ways that we rate people highly in our eyes. The sum total of all that counts for status. It has many components, but one thing we are doing, say with education, is trying to make ourselves seem more impressive and more appropriate as an associate in many roles. And that's also a function we achieve in education, even if we aren't very conscious of it. So that the story here is that we evolved through DNA and through culture to develop habits of behavior that were functional, that achieved ends that make sense for us, i.e. it makes sense to convince people you're loyal to them and to impress them with your capabilities. But we didn't necessarily evolve to be consciously aware of how our behavior achieves functions, or that those functions are in fact the main functions we achieve with those behaviors.
But let's say at the end of the day, how much would be roughly, like how much is about signaling a variety of these kind of things?
It's well over half. I think if you ask particular people outside yourself, and you ask for each things they do, how much do they care what other people think of them? I think you'll find out they seem to care a lot. People just do seem, in fact, to care a lot what other people think of them. And they take that into account to a great degree in what they do. When other people's interpretation of their behavior changes, that can distress them a lot and do substantial changes in their behaviors.
But why would this be more than half and so dominant, or maybe even much more than half? There's so many different drives that people have, like even survival. That seems like such a basic drive. Why would signaling end up being such a big majority of what's motivating people?
So humans are a very social species. And so in ancestral and human environments, the main hostile or difficult part of their environment was other people. So in a very small group of mammals, say a family, internal family dynamics were important, but dealing with the larger world, predators, prey, etc., was more important. But humans were in unusually large groups, unusually large numbers, and they were unusually large primates. And so given the size of the groups, they were relatively safe from outside problems. That is, they could manage to share food and maintain a steady diet. They could protect themselves from predators. They could move to safer grounds in a flood or whatever. But that larger group became the focus of their attention. That is, if the larger group liked you or didn't like you, that just made a huge difference to your life. And so that induced our human ancestors to evolve to pay attention, most importantly, and with most of their energies, to the people around them, and to want to not only be able to read those people around them, to judge their intention and abilities, loyalty, but also to make a good impression on them, to think about how their actions would be seen by the people around them, and to do that well. In fact, we say in the book that your conscious mind, that's its main job, is to watch the people around you, try to guess how they're thinking about you, and then to have in your mind good answers to whatever questions or concerns they would have about you. That's your conscious mind's job. It isn't actually to know what you're actually doing and why. It's to maintain a good story about what you've been doing and why that will be, good for the people around you to hear. So that's why your conscious mind doesn't actually know why you do things. What it knows is a good story that it can defend well, given the details of your context, that will reassure the people around you that they should see you as a worthy associate, loyal, following the rules, etc.
I think in the book you reference this idea of the press secretary, that a person is really just like the press secretary and everything else is sort of like hidden away or something.
Right, and the important thing to notice about the press secretary is, in fact, the press secretary and the person they are a press secretary for don't actually sit down and talk all the time about all the real reasons that they do things. Press secretary's job is often easier to achieve if, upon asked why the person they represent did something, they can think of the best reason that would go off well with their audience. And then they can sincerely present that best reason without actually consulting with their person they represent to find out their real reasons.
Right. I just wonder, this is maybe also another example, like maybe people's idea of the self, isn't correct. And there's all these hidden parts interacting and there isn't this one center looking out the way people imagine it. But there still are all these different parts. So why would this press secretary be so privileged? Why is it considered, like you referenced, that is really the real self, that is the conscious ego. But to me, it just seems like that should just be one aspect of many different aspects in the brain.
The key point is humans have norms, we have rules about behavior, and that when you behave in some way with other people, around other people, you might be accused of violating norms. People might say that you were being bad in some way. And in order to have a coherent response to that, what we expect is for you to give an integrated view of yourself. It's not going to work for one part of you to say, well, there's 5 parts of us. This is what I saw. Why don't you talk to the other guy next and go through all the parts of me and see if you can make up a story from that. We don't have much tolerance for that. We want you to present your story to the rest of us, and it's your job to integrate yourself in that story. We don't have much patience for figuring that stuff out. So we want each person to be a single coherent source that presents the view of what they're doing and why in the world. And then when somebody has an accusation against you of what you were doing and why, you are supposed to counter that, if possible, with your own presentation of what you were doing and why. And that should be an integrated presentation that subsumes all the parts of you that are relevant so that you could tell us why this accusation is wrong. So the accusation will be a simple account of what you were doing and why. It'll typically say that you are selfish and lazy or whatever, that you have these norms of what you should have been doing and you were doing something else. And we'll have a simple story about why you were doing that thing. And that will be the basis of the accusation against you. And now it's your job to counter that. And your job needs to be as simple as theirs. Your story needs to be as simple as theirs in terms of what you were doing instead. So if you give a story, well, maybe you're right. I don't know. There's 20 different parts of me. Maybe one of them was like that. But the other 3 of us talking together right now, we didn't see that. Like if you imagine a large organization of 20 people, 20 actually human individuals, and you accuse that somebody in that organization went and stole something or hurt somebody, if you said, well, I didn't do it, George didn't do it, Fred here didn't do it, maybe one of the other 17 people did it. That's not a very reassuring response to this accusation. The question is, did any of you do this? And you want somebody who can speak for that.
So it's not that the press secretary of the brain is necessarily the most important. It's just the part that communicates.
Right. It's the spokesperson. Exactly. So it presents the view to the outside.
So it could be that the person maybe has a lot of agency and strategy and planning and all that, but since that's not the part that communicates, that's sort of removed from the sense of self as they view it.
Well, this is the point of a press secretary. We accept that because someone's been appointed as a press secretary, that they are authorized on behalf of the rest of the organization to speak for them.
Okay. And I guess going back to the overall theory, what would be cases where you would say either here, this is clearly an example where signaling isn't the main motive, or where there's a test and we could check if signaling is the motive and determine it? What would be examples of that?
If you just want to ask where in life do we see behavior that's plausibly not signaling, well, the best candidates would seem to me to be behaviors that we do but don't want to call attention to, that don't look good, but we still do them, like scratching your butt when it itches, say, right? I mean, picking your nose. I mean, people do these things. They are widely seen as not very impressive or attractive, and yet people still do them. Now, sometimes people do things that they say other people don't like, and then they actually think other people do like them. People like to be rebels, for example, and call attention to how the authorities don't like this, and the world's not looking at me kindly for this, but I'm still going to do it because I'm true to myself. And that person's really trying to impress you with it. But there are some other things we do, like scratching your butt, that don't seem to impress anybody, and you still do them.
But what about more basic things like eating food and at least some aspects? I know we discussed medicine a little bit, but like so many things seem to be for survival and things like that, not just like picking the nose. So
picking nose isn't really survival. It's for comfort a bit more.
Right.
You won't die if you don't pick your nose.
But don't those things seem to be mostly about just wanting food because you survive and it's pleasurable and you're not necessarily trying to signal that much?
I mean, so there's a literature on poverty that's long noted that poor people could get the nutrition and calories they need with much cheaper food than they seem to use. And then people talk about how they need some self-respect and some little pleasure in their life. And, that's a basic question about what people eat. We have literature on the food and nutrition, and apparently people are actually not very knowledgeable about which foods have how much nutrition.
So right. Well, that's not necessarily
surprising.
About signaling. It could just be, people developed when, they evolved when not having enough calories was so basic, and now we're just overwhelmed with sugar. And then we just eat much too much sugar, but we're not trying to signal anything from it.
Let's go through some correlates of food. People are really eager to have variety in their food when it's a social context. So if you order at a restaurant and somebody orders the, meatloaf, then you feel like if you were going to order the meatloaf, you now need to pick something else because it's awkward to order the same thing as somebody else at the table. Or if you were all there last week and you ordered the meatloaf, you can order something different this time. So people go out of their way to make sure they have a variety of food. And they want to make sure they go to different places if it's a group going around. Whereas if you think about what you eat for breakfast, people are really pretty okay with eating pretty much the same thing for breakfast every day because nobody else sees it. And if you think about, say, the flavor of your toothpaste, almost nobody needs 5 different flavors of toothpaste that they rotate day to day in order to make sure they have a variety of toothpaste. They pretty much are happy with having the same flavor toothpaste every morning or whenever they brush their teeth. So we see definitely social effects on food. And as I mentioned, if you just wanted the nutrition of the food, people have long known some very basic recipes that would achieve that at low cost and low effort, and that most people would be ashamed to have people hear that that's what they eat. So there are substantially social incentives in food that look like they care about what the food they eat looks like to other people.
But even if people eat dinner alone, they often will have a varied dinner, and it seems they just
not as
appreciate
much,
having that variety.
Actually, when people eat dinner alone, they are more often eating the same food over and over again.
Okay. I mean, to me, I wouldn't I know there's aspects of food that are signaling, but to me, I wouldn't have thought that's the main thing. It just seems so basic.
Well, I mean, in some sense, whatever doesn't vary can sort of fade into the background, and we're looking at variations. The fact, obviously it is a physical fact that we all need to get a certain number of calories or we will just die. So clearly anybody who's been around for long enough not die, they must have gotten the right amount of calories. And that's just a constraint on what happened. Something must have ensured that they got enough calories, otherwise they'd be dead. But when we're looking at variations in behavior, since not that many people die today, we don't need to invoke the variation in calories very much to explain behavior. That's more of a constant. Obviously in the background, you have to breathe. You didn't breathe, you don't die much faster than if you didn't eat. And therefore, if you see anybody who's been around for 24 hours, they've been breathing enough. And that's just a physical fact about their behavior. You can infer from the fact they still exist, but clearly something in their body and their minds must be making sure they breathe. Making sure they're in environments where they can continue to breathe. That's clearly happening, but we just don't need to invoke that much to explain the variations of behavior that we see.
Okay. And let's say turning to something like consumption and art. So there, clearly signaling plays a huge part. Certainly there's a lot of evidence that the inherent...
It's not clear to many people. Just to be clear. So I think a thing to notice here, we have 10 chapters in our book about 10 areas of life. Everybody has some areas of life that are more sacred to them. And they will find our thesis less hard to swallow about the areas that are precious to them. But if you go to the other areas of life that you don't care so much about, most people are quite willing to believe that in those areas of life, other people are mostly doing signaling. So if you say in art signaling, sure, that just tells me you're not really into art that much, okay? People who are really into art, this is a very contentious point of view. They will push back substantially and say, no, I really love the art. It's not about signaling.
Well, I would say even there, like consumption and art and appreciating live performances, all those things. So it seems to me clear there's some aspect that's signaling, but I'm wondering if there's other aspects where people are just looking for something special. And even if they weren't going to tell anybody about it, they're just looking for some kind of change. Like, let's say movies are so common, they want a special experience, they go to a live performance. Objectively, the movie is better quality, better edited, all those things. They could see it more clearly. But maybe they want just something that's unique. And could it be that there's something that's unique, even if they're not going to tell anyone about it, they'll still enjoy that unique experience?
Well, so we were just talking about uniqueness in food. It seems like the preference for uniqueness has a substantial social element to it. Often we are, so for example, with clothes, like my shirt and your shirt, you and I might be embarrassed to wear the same shirt 3 days in a row. We'd want shirts that not only were different, so you could buy 3 shirts exactly like that, but you'd still be embarrassed to wear them 3 days in a row because other people might think they were the same shirt. But we're okay with our underwear and socks looking the same day after day. They're
not
still
necessarily
clothes.
wearing the same ones.
Well, no, but it's okay with them looking the same. Whereas we're going to make sure our shirts look different from day to day. Our taste for variety is to a substantial extent social. So it is true that we just have a certain way we can get bored and we want something to vary, but there are areas of our life where we're not that bothered by constancy. Like I said, the same breakfast, the same toothpaste, same underwear, same pillow you sleep on every night. There's just large areas of our life where we're fine with those areas not changing so much. And the areas that we're especially eager for variety in do tend to be these social areas where other people will notice our behavior in those areas.
But how come when we're not specifically telling other people about it, why can't we then accept that it's mostly not signaling? Like the reason they're eating dinner is because they enjoy the varied dinner for its own sake.
Inhabit the hypothesis that we involved to do many things for signaling, right? This hypothesis doesn't suggest that we are going to be paying close attention to who's watching us and switch to this other mode when nobody's watching. The question is, what would be the point of that other mode? If we evolve these things to signal, we're going to just be doing it all the time because that's just a simpler strategy. And another factor is when you say, you have a friend and you happen to notice them in a city, all sitting home all by themselves at some cafe, and you think they didn't know you saw them there. They thought they were all alone. Now, however you see them behave at this cafe when you think they think nobody's watching them will be disproportionately influential to you about what this person's really like when they're alone. So when we are more likely to be alone, anybody who does see us at those moments will draw an especially strong inference from us about what we're like when we're alone. So, there's never a guarantee that no one will see what we're doing. There's just degrees of variation in the probability that someone might see. And again, it's just simpler if you just have the same behavior at all times. That's a very simple strategy to make sure you look good, is just always be consistent. Because if anybody ever sees you being really quite different alone than you are around other people, in a situation where they didn't think you'd realize they were seeing them, that rumor will spread fast. People will love to tell the story about what you were like when you were alone compared to what you're like around other people.
Well, that could be a good question, I guess. If people are doing it alone because they want to be consistent, so then maybe at a certain point, it blurs a little whether it's really about signaling, but that people actually end up valuing the value on its own, and because they're keeping to it no matter what.
So a key issue here is the proximity of explanation that we're going for. So every time you do anything, brushing your teeth, etc., we can explain that behavior at several levels of indirection from that behavior. The most proximate explanation would involve the thing that's in your head right then. At the time you do it, what were you thinking when you did it, for example? And what were the immediate constraints on your environment? And what had you been doing a moment before? Those will be proximate explanations for what you're doing at that moment. But we can also look for distal explanations, explanations that aren't tied to the particular contextual features of that situation, but are looking at a broad aggregate view of just people like that doing things like that, and why the hell do they do that? And that's what our book is more focused on, just asking, what are the best distal explanations of behavior? So distal explanations are not making much of a commitment about what's in your head. So if, for example, people evolved a habit of helping their associates when they were sick, we could say that a habit evolved to show loyalty to associates. That explanation doesn't very much pin down what's in your head at that moment. What are you thinking? It's more tied to the long-term causal influences on that range of behavior. So our book is primarily about that distal context, the large range of similar behavior that over a long period, evolution of various forms would have formed and shaped that behavior. And we're agnostic more about what's going on in your head as you do that, or what other people just said to you, or what happened just before, or what are the constraints around you. Those are less what we're trying to explain.
So you're saying that even secretly in your head, you might just be helping someone just to help them. And it's just that there's this more long-term cause where it's to signal that you care and things like that.
Right. So why did you get it into your head that you wanted to help them? Where did that come from? Why did you have that care about that person in that context? That has some causes, and we're looking at those larger causes.
Okay. So, I mean, that in a way is a little milder because it's not saying each individual thing is directly driven by signaling and that the person just isn't aware. It's just that there's this bigger overall, like, drive toward signaling, but in an individual cases, a person might just really want to help the person, even when you like dive deep into their brain.
Psychology, psychotherapy, most common sense literature is consistent of the opinion that the thought you had at the moment you did something is not a very reliable way of understanding you. The world is pretty sure that people don't really know where the thought in their head came from and why, and there is a lot of pattern to that, and that's what we try to explain after we explain what was in your head at that moment.
Okay, just related to this, I know you also have a section on charity in the book. So you kind of give an example, I think, that effective altruism would be the rational way to do it, or something similar to that. And that's not how most people give. So would at least the effective altruist, are they really driven by trying to do good? And when they decided to join the effective altruists, at that point, were they doing it just because they wanted to do good as opposed to signaling?
Our book is focused on the largest, most consistent patterns in human behavior across space and time. We're happy to notice that the stories we give about that are wrong and to try to find better stories for that. That still leaves a lot of variation in behavior to explain. Our book isn't intended to explain every detail of every person's behavior. It's intended to just get a first cut right. What overall are we doing in these various contexts on average? So that means if you say, yes, but this doesn't apply to me because I'm special, you could be, because we're just trying to explain the overall average, the overall typical range of behavior here. You could happen to be special. Now, the fact that you want to feel special and are somewhat offended by this picture of you is not particular good evidence that you are in fact special. You will want further evidence than that you are special. And I think you should be a bit suspicious of this, eagerness to conclude that you're special. But this is about the overall averages of typical behavior, not about explaining each and every person's exact choice.
And I guess a question, you wrote a whole book on this topic and then you address this a little bit at the end, but how do you view this overall? Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should society try to fix it? What should we do about this?
You and everyone else was built not to see this. So if the evolutionary context that made this judgment about you is still right, then you are better off not knowing. You're better off just forgetting what you heard here and going on with your life. And you're all really quite capable of that. That's just a human capacity we're pretty sure of. You can just forget this and live your life as you were. But if you are a person whose job in the world, your specialty is understanding human behavior and what's really going on to some extent, then it's your job to know a bit more about this, even if that's unpleasant, because that's your job, that's your role. So you might be a social scientist, you might be a policymaker, or you might have a job in the world like being a manager or a salesperson where it's especially important for you to understand people's motives and what they're doing and why. Or you might be perhaps just more like a nerd like me for whom your intuitions don't work so well and explicit reasoning could be a more useful substitute for your bad intuitions. Those are the kinds of people for whom this will be more useful. But center place will be those people who actually claim that their role in the world is to study human behavior and make recommendations for policy on the basis of that, like people who do education policy or medical policy or political or charity policy. Those people should, because of their chosen role, actually pay attention to what's really going on and use that to think about policy in those areas. And unfortunately, most academics who do policy, near policy in these areas do not actually pay attention to these hidden motives. Most people who study medicine talk as if the whole point of medicine was to help you not get sick. Most people who study educational policy talk as if the main point of education was to learn the material, etc., all the way down the line. So that we criticize that. We say, no, other people, it makes sense for them to ignore all of this because evolution gave you this set of capacities, and unless the world around you is different from what it thought, you should go along with its recommendations. But those of you who declare yourself in opposition to your inherited instincts because your fundamental job in the world is to actually understand what's going on, then this is your job.
Do you think that an individual on their own could nudge themselves to be a more, inherently a little less selfish and not just for signaling purposes?
Well, a little, sure, but how little is the question. Some people have come at our book as a self-help book and wondered how they could make themselves better. So we have ideals for ourselves, and then we see the reality, and there's a conflict there, and there's two ways to resolve that conflict. One way is to lower your ideals to the level of your behavior, and the other is to raise your behavior to the level of your ideals. Obviously, we do some mixture of both, but we think that this is human nature here. It's very old, it's very deeply embedded, and you, through force of will, are only going to be able to make a modest difference here. So you should probably better ask yourself, where in your life is it most important that you make a difference? So for example, if you're a social scientist, I'd say it's not that important for you to get more realistic about your attitude toward your mother or your wife or your children or, local sports team. Yes, you could put effort into those things and try to achieve a more realistic assessment of your motivations in those areas. But to what end? How much is the payoff there? If your role in the world is someone studying, say, the medical policy, I'd say use your limited ability to be more realistic about your role in the world, about the thing that you do that makes the biggest impact on the rest of us. That's where you should try to be more realistic.
And is there anything, even if individuals only change a little, society pushing for it overall, could that have a large effect in aggregate, or it's just unrealistic to expect people to change?
Well, you mentioned when we were chatting before that you had just seen a post I had put up on the weekend on my blog, Overcoming Bias, about rationality. And I would say that the attempt or the project of humans to make some of their big decisions more rational is exactly this sort of a question. And I say in the post, I'm most optimistic about us creating institutions that channel our natural incentives to more naturally make us more rational. I am less optimistic about just by force of will declaring and making yourself more rational or being in a community that has norms about, styles and methods. I think that also has a limited effect. But there are ways we can make institutions that more powerfully push people to be rational in certain ways. And I think we should focus on designing and adopting institutions that can induce more rationality. And you should know in the background that people will resist that as these natural habits we've been talking about here are obstacles. It's not enough to merely inspire people to be rational or exhort them to be rational or remind them that sure would be nice if they were rational. You need to create institutions that give them incentives to be rational. And if you do that, you can actually move things a lot.
Okay, what would be the way for institutions to make people more rational?
Well, betting markets, I think, are a powerful force. So when there's a betting market on something, there are parts inside of you that realize that if you declare something that's not very well thought through and put money down on it, you're on average going to lose money. And that part of you doesn't want to lose the money. And especially if you just did a bunch of that in the past and just lost a bunch of money doing it that way, this part of you will speak up more and more loudly and say, no, 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 we can't just keep losing money that way. And that will induce you to either back off and exit that area or stay, but with a more reliable strategy that will more focus on your evidence and your good reasons for it, and make bets on the basis of positions that are better supported, even if those are awkward positions, sort of socially undesirable ones that other people wouldn't respect you as much for saying, etc. You will see that you don't want to lose money.
Okay. Yeah, I guess briefly to discuss this, I know you've done a lot of research into prediction markets and betting markets. How would you handle, I guess, conflicts of interest that arise? Like if you have an internal betting market in a company and the people in the company also influence by working on the project, the outcome, how is that? It seems like just a very basic tension in the concept.
And it's not. That's the thing to learn. So it's surprisingly not. That is, in betting markets where some of the traders want to influence the price in ways that aren't, because of what they know, but just they would like people to believe certain things, they have an incentive to try to manipulate the price. But perception that some people will trade on the basis of those motives induces other people all the more to trade against them and makes the price on average more accurate. And that's something we not only see in theory, but we see in labs and in the field. Prediction markets, betting markets, when some people want to distort the prices because they would like people to believe things about what the prices say, those motives, that behavior, on average, makes prices more accurate.
So that addresses, I guess, if they're betting in this biased way. But what about afterwards when they do the work? Let's say they bet this project will fail, and now they're working on it. Won't that cause them to affect the project in a negative way?
I was just addressing manipulation. Now you're thinking of sabotage.
Right. Or subtle sabotage.
Okay. Now, forever, when we have events in the world and we try to give people incentives to predict those events, that also gives people an incentive to change those events. So this is not just true about prediction markets, it's true about any way you give anybody incentives to predict anything. And incentives to predict become incentives to change. And so you just have to take that into account in asking people what things to predict. So for example, say you have a project with a deadline and you'd like people to predict, will we make the deadline? And you might think one way to predict the deadline is to sabotage the project and make it not make the deadline. But then what you really want to do is ask people to predict, if we change the project, would that change the chance of the deadline? And then what you also want to do is just make sure everybody who's on the project, say, who has substantial power to sabotage it, has a positive stake and never bets that below zero. So once you make the constraint, everybody has a positive stake. You don't have to worry about them sabotaging the project.
But what if the people on the project recognize, like, wait, this isn't going to make the deadline or it's not going to work out in some other way? Now what happens? How do they communicate that information?
Well, so say we give everybody on the project with a deadline $100 if we make the project. Now, if you become more optimistic about the project, you could up that to $120. If you become pessimistic, you could cut it down to $80 or even $60. So you can reveal your information about the project by moving up or down. You just can't go below zero.
Okay, interesting. Because, yeah, I feel like there's certainly cases like large organizations. People might have information. They might think, even not just the deadline, they might think the project won't have such a big impact. So if there's a way for them to communicate that without them harming it, then it does seem like something that could be helpful.
But you should realize just all the other institutions you are now using in your world that give people incentives to predict things like, will the project work, also create incentives for sabotage. That's part of the world you're in now. This is not a new feature of the world that's prediction markets at.
Well, right now it's much harder if you're internally working on something to benefit from it failing.
It often is. Often you say that'll never work, and then you undermine it, and then when it doesn't work, you say, "See, I told you so." That's just a thing that happens all the time.
So, one other thing I wanted to discuss. Until now, it could be that even though so much was about signaling, it had a lot of these positive externalities. Like, you wanted to show how successful you are, but you went and accomplished something successful. But if AI starts doing more and more useful work, is there a risk that, so much of what people do won't even have any positive benefits?
Signaling, incentives, and behavior changes in the context of the technology and the world you're in. So we've certainly seen that over time. So for example, realistic painting was held in very high regard until photography appeared, making realistic painting relatively easy to achieve without much personal virtue or ability. And then we changed the standards of art so that realism was no longer valued so much. And that was a change in what we value and what we do in response to technology changing the relative difficulty and ease of different kinds of signals. And so certainly at the moment, people are concerned that our habit of using education, i.e. having people write essays as a way to see who's good, is interfered with by people being able to get their large language models to give them good essays. And I, as a teacher, have to, try to deal with that. So if that becomes severe enough, we'll just have to stop assigning essays, or stop assigning essays that people write on their own, say, when they could get access to a large language. We might have to have them write the essay in the classroom in, on a 2-hour exam or something, because we really care about the ability of students to do it on their own as opposed to just do it. And that does sort of undermine the theory that the point of school is to have you be able to do things. We are actually much more interested in whether your ability to do something says something about your personal characteristics and less in whether you can do it. So you might have thought, well, we wanted people to write essays because essays were useful in the world and people will have many opportunities to write essays. So, hey, let's have them learn to write essays and we'll grade them on the quality of the essays they produce. But it turns out when they can produce high quality essays, we go, oh no, that's not what we wanted. We wanted to make it harder to write essays so that we can see that they wrote the essay. And that's the important thing.
Okay, so I guess that still leaves a question. What will people do that actually accomplishes anything? Is there a risk, I guess, that have we already reached that point?
To answer that, you need to have a model of, in the near future, what are the relative abilities of humans and machines? And that's exactly what we're not so sure about. That is, in the last 3 years, for example, we've seen a big burst in the ability of large language models to do many language-oriented tasks that humans used to be able to do much better. But we're not sure exactly where that's going in terms of the relative abilities. And that makes all the difference here. In the areas where humans are not so good compared to large language models, presumably what we want to do is just less evaluate people on those criteria, at least when they can't be separated away from their language models. And we'll try to focus on the things where humans are substantially better than the language models. And we'll try to make sure our classes and our exams and our various ways we celebrate essayists and op-ed writers in the world focus on those sorts of things. But until we know which things those are, we won't be able to say very well.
And let's say AI is able to do 98% of what humans do today, or what humans did a few years ago. At that point, is there a risk that more and more of what humans do will just be driven by zero-sum status competitions? And is that something we should be concerned about?
If AI can do 98% of the things humans do in ordinary jobs, then AI will just take over the economy. And then it'll be the AI signaling to each other. That's most of the activity. And then it's about, what do some AIs able to do that others can't that will make those AIs look more impressive? Humans will just not be very much part of the story anymore. But we're still a long way from that. 98% is a ways from where we are. That's many decades, plausibly.
Will that cause that 2% to expand to a much bigger part of the economy because everything else becomes cheaper? And now this small amount, it used to be most of the economy was farming, but now the parts that weren't have grown a lot. So will the small amount that AI can't do just become much, much larger?
So it's ambiguous what you meant by percent there. I was taking in sort of economic terms, when AI gets 90% of all income that's paid to labor, that's what I was thinking in terms of. And at that point, the economy is basically mostly an AI economy and the humans are a small part. Now, maybe you meant the 2% today that becomes a much larger percent because humans are still the main customers and then that's the thing they pay for. Then it's no longer 2%, it's much larger, right? So certainly over time in the past, we had large sectors of the economy, say agriculture, that got large fractions of world income. And then as we got better at that, that section of the economy declined and we put more effort into other sections of the economy. So today agriculture is only a tiny fraction of the economy, a few percent, whereas once upon a time it was, say, 80% of the economy. And so it's still agriculture, but it doesn't matter as much more now because we are now focused on other things. Ordinary people, who are the most of the customers, only want so much food. And so when agriculture productivity went up, we just decided we would pay less of our income for food. So if, in fact, AI gets better at lots of things, but then we value those things less in aggregate, then humans will still dominate the economy. And that's the way it has happened over the last few centuries. So that could continue for a while, that AI gets better at some things that we pay a lot for now, but then we just pay less for those later because we only want so much of them and we pay more for something else. But that isn't obviously going to last forever. Like, you could have said the same thing about horses, of course. Once we had ways to replace horses on some tasks, we could have valued the other uses of horses so much more. And we have valued sort of horses as pets so much that we now have about as many horses as we used to, but we just have so much more of the rest of the economy. It's still, horses are a much smaller fraction of the economy.
So I know you've written about this before. Most people were thinking about it, but with the rise of like ChatGPT and large language models, how has that caused you to think about your different predictions? In some ways it seems maybe rapid AI is coming more quickly, but in some ways maybe certain things seem less threatening. How overall has it caused you to evaluate?
Let's see. Large language models were more human-like than most AI we had seen before. So people in the past had just focused on the fact that AI tended to be pretty alien and different from humans to predict that, in fact, AI would later be very alien and different from humans, and that difference was part of their moral evaluation of AI. And so large language models, I think, have shown that as AI gets more capable, it may well continue to get more human-like, plausibly because the way to be a powerful AI is to inherit from humanity, which is the best example of intelligence so far. So that's one thing we've learned, is that at least the current generation of AI is just much more human-like than past generations of AI. So there's less to worry about in their alienness. Another thing we've learned, I think, is that as people have seen AI up close, they have had more what I call a near view of it than a far view. There's this literature in psychology called construal level theory about how we see differently things near and far. And plausibly, most AI analysis up until recently was from a relatively far point of view. And it has the characteristic features of far views, which include the ability to get very concerned about sort of abstract differences. And then as AI has become more near to people, that they see these concrete systems that are vivid and up close, they have more of a near view reaction to AI. And that's somewhat predictable, but the details are interesting to see. I think that's what we're seeing, a near view of AI. And in fact, in the near view, people are just less animated by sort of far view fears than they had been before, because far view was the only view they had. And so many people who were animated by those far view fears are rather disappointed now that people seeing the AIs up close are just not very engaged by those far view fears, because the concrete AIs in front of them just don't seem very scary, which I agree, they just don't seem very scary.
Right. I mean, a major problem of them is that they're too nice. And that
I don't know if they're too nice,
people.
but they're nice.
Well, they talk about how people have some disorder or strange belief, and it like sometimes encourages them because it's.
But
so
people
nice.
do that too. When we judge people for being nice, often we think people are nice when they do those sorts of things. So I don't know that the AIs are being more nice than we expect of people. Seems to me they are roughly about as nice as you might want them to be.
But could it be that this version of AI doesn't seem so scary? But could it be that learning language, which is clearly very important for intelligence, doesn't involve this kind of like goal seeking in the same way? But as they train them to accomplish goals, that there'll be more risks there than there were for learning language?
I mean, obviously, as AIs get more capable, there will just be more risks of all sorts. That's just the nature of things that are more capable. More capable things have more risks. More powers and capabilities of all sorts, the more possible things they could do, the more of those things you could worry about. But the near view is the view that's dominating at the moment. Plausibly, I would say our history of AI is we have these booms of concern and interest, which then overreach, which then has a crash afterwards. Summer turns to winter, and we have this repeated cycle for a long time. The simple stats on that, plus the details of this cycle, suggest to me that this is going to be another cycle we certainly have a lot of evidence at the moment that the amount of investment going to AI is like an order of magnitude more than the amount of revenue coming out of customers. And that's a bet on, revenue from customers increasing a lot over the next few years, but the most likely scenario is that fails. And then at some point you can't sustain all this investment far beyond the customer revenue. And so you have a fall, and then we have to wait another generation for the next boom in AI that might then achieve full human level capacity.
So you don't think there's a good chance that this time it's somewhat different in that it's much more general purpose than previous?
Well, every time it had a good chance, but a good chance was still well below 50-50. It has a chance. Every time had a chance. This time has a chance, but the most likely outcome is failure. Even when you have a good chance, that's the most likely outcome in most investment booms.
And then another thing, I know you wrote The Age of M's, and I guess there it modeled this idea of, yes, The Age of M right there. It modeled this idea of people kind of being uploaded or building AIs based on human brains and just running digitally. Has the advancement of things like ChatGPT and large language models shown an alternative path, even if you don't think it'll necessarily immediately be solve all AI, but it shows they didn't need to use the human brain for
well before I wrote this book, it was clear that M's were only one of many possible paths to achieving, artificial intelligence, machines as smart as people. And it's still been an open question which path will be achieved. My rationale would be to say, look, if it's worth having 100 books on the future, it's worth having a book on a 1% scenario. So if this scenario is more than 1%, then that justifies the analysis, and I don't have to know very exactly what exactly the percent is. So, I would say the AI versus M scenario were both plausible 10 years ago, and they're still both plausible now. And I don't know that LLMs have much changed those relative probabilities. There have also been progress toward M's. Who can say? Neither of them is close.
Well, it seems, we're much more advanced, it seems, in AI that, is this model versus actually understanding the brain on the level to digitally emulate it.
Okay, but the important thing to understand is that for at least a century, and actually much longer, we just have these bursts of concern and interest in AI, and each burst is based on a great advance in capabilities. It wasn't just, so many years had passed and people said, we must be closer. We have had bursts of capabilities where we have new approaches that are much more powerful than previous approaches, and that just happens repeatedly, roughly every 30 years for a long time. And that's the burst right now. But every previous burst produced people who thought plausibly, could this be the time? Is this enough? And they all had new technologies and new investment and new excitement and new things it could do that the previous versions couldn't. And that's what's true this time as well. So the mere fact that you have new abilities doesn't mean this time is different, because every time had new ability.
And I guess another question, what do you think of the risk that when we do get to this point, whether it's very soon or in the further future, even if AI seems like it might be risky and that we might not have full control, there won't be a way to hold back companies from developing it because they'll all be worried that their competitors will. And if in America they prevent them, they'll be worried in China they'll develop it. Is that something to be worried about?
I am less feared than I guess you are about not having full control. The world so far has just almost never had full control of new technologies. That's just now how things have gone. For many centuries now, new technologies arise whenever some people find some advantage from adopting them. And there's no committee that tries to calculate its full consequences for humanity over the coming centuries from adopting technology. That's just not what we've done. If that's what you wanted to happen in technology, you should have been pretty disappointed for many centuries now that the world has just not been doing that. And so it's also, of course, quite plausible that this will continue in the future, that when AI becomes possible, those who find an advantage from adopting AI will in fact do so without consulting the rest of the world, because that's how all technology has gone for a long time. We've more rarely, but sometimes had some sort of global regulatory consensus where we shut down technologies. I think that's mostly been a mistake, but that has happened a few times. So it could happen on this technology, perhaps. The odds are against it, and I'm not particularly in favor of it, but you maybe disagree. But again, you have to realize that you're up against world inertia. The world has, in fact, in the past, typically just adopted technologies when they were in local interest. So the main exception, I guess, as you know, would be nuclear energy. And so nuclear energy, people were able to create a fear about them, a very visceral fear based in part on the nuclear bombs, substantial part on the nuclear bombs, even mostly on the nuclear bombs, that made people terrified of nuclear energy more than they really should have been. And so we did, in fact, basically not use nuclear energy in the world. And still, our world, one of the biggest differences of our world from what somebody from 1940 would have predicted is that we've had, 80 years of nuclear energy and hardly made any use of it. And I think that was a mistake. But so you might hope that that's what'll happen for AI, but you will need somehow to create a fear about AI comparable to the fear of nuclear weapons. And I just don't see that. You probably should hope some big bad thing will happen with AI that will scare people, but I'm not seeing what that could be.
Nuclear weapons, they're able to control uranium, at least to some extent, but I don't know how easily they could control
it's much more feasible technically to control nuclear energy than it is AI, because AI is based on a much more widespread technology of computers.
And besides the risk, I guess, of AI itself causing harm, is there a risk that, or is it something you're concerned about, that AI will just spread knowledge in a way that could make it easy for people to cause harm? People talk about it being more easy to manufacture a virus. Is that something we should be worried about?
I mean, so far in the history of science and technology, most thought leaders have been wanting to spread knowledge and to make knowledge more accessible and more widely available and actionable. And so that always has contained a mixture of some of the knowledge that could and was used for harm, but the usual claim has been that overall more knowledge is good. I'm going to bet that's true here too.
Well, what if anybody could print this very harmful virus and we don't have the same defensive capabilities against it? That would be a clear cause.
Our defensive capabilities will be increasing with the offensive capabilities. That's been the true for many areas of technology for a long time. If you only projected increase of offensive technologies without the increase in defensive technologies, you should always predict things are going to be much worse on the basis of that.
Well, I mean, nuclear weapons, it doesn't seem like we have a matching defensive capability against them.
That's an exception, right? You're going to have to convince me there's other things an exception like that.
Okay. I mean, I could see how we might be worried if something is really bad, even if we don't know the exact odds, that maybe we should still take certain measures.
Well, what you really mean is something is very powerful.
Right.
But, so far in history, powerful technologies have been things that have benefited us the most. So low power technology also have negative versions and positive versions. High power technologies have negative and positive versions. But on average, through history, we've gained much benefit from all technology, both powerful and less powerful. And so you'll have to say that a particular technology, say like nuclear energy, is an exception, and convince people it is an exception to get people to treat it different. And as I said, they have in fact treated nuclear energy differently on the basis, but mainly because of the terror brought by the images of nuclear bombs. And you don't have a terror like that for AI that move most people, and you don't have something yet that moves me. So there you are.
And I guess since you view solving AI as something that's going to happen much further in the future, has that affected any of your decisions or investments or anything like that?
Well, I'm intellectual, as we talk about looking for important neglected things. So while everybody else is really focused on AI here, I see it as a little overrated, and I'm focusing on other things. Which is, odd because, for decades, I was one of the few people calling attention to the issue. But then I noticed that when the issue finally reaches a lot of attention, nobody really cares about those of us who called attention to it early. It doesn't really count for much at all. And so nobody really is interested in the fact that I have things to say about this earlier than others. That's just not how prestige is allocated for these things.
And you haven't sold all your investments or anything like that?
I mean, I certainly am not long in AI. I'm tempted to go short, except I'm not sure exactly when to go short. But, I'm just not very skilled at doing those sort of financial things. I haven't invested much in the mechanics and infrastructure for that. So I'm mostly verbally short, saying this will probably decline like all the other booms have, but still, increasing the overall level. I'm happy to see the new tools. I mean, actually, compared to previous AI booms, I'm actually more using these new AIs in my life. So for example, I actually just see a big opening for, say, polymaths like myself here. The world knows many particular things, and then struggles to integrate all the particular things it knows. And so we polymaths, our job is to integrate the many particulars. And an obstacle is the struggle to go learn new particulars to integrate them. And the LLMs, basically by their nature, do a small scale integration across all the topics they read about, but they basically are knowing about a much wider range of topics than any individual human would. And they do a modest level integration, but what they don't do is higher level integration. They don't look across the wide range of things they own, just ponder the inconsistencies and try to, make more integration. So maybe they will in the next 10 years start to do that better, but at the moment they're not, which is an opening for people like me, because now I can integrate more different areas better because I can just ask the LLM to summarize each particular area. And then it's going to do a pretty good job if I keep it at a low level of abstraction, talking about the particulars of each area and what the main results there. And then I can be looking for the integration of those much more quickly than I could in the past, because it's much easier to get up to speed on the details of particular areas.
So have you found that you've actually been able to discover things more easily or get
I think so,
more
yes.
ideas?
Yes. So for example, over this last week, I think I have a better theory of the origin of the modern world in terms of modern culture, and attributing modern culture to the rise of basically high school. When you make young people together and they spend all day together and then they form a group identity, then they more often create new cultural movements that are youth movements. And much of modernity is merely repeated youth movements, where each new group of youth finds some ideal in themselves that the world seems to be against or less sympathetic to, and they push this ideal through their movement. And that's been the modern world for a little over a century. And people have struggled, I think, to understand what changed, because it's not just technology. That is, technology had changed pretty radically up until, say, 1880 without much cultural change. And then all of a sudden, soon after that, cultural change started really to ratchet up. And that's about when high school appeared. And I think my ability to ask questions of LLMs, say, to get the rough stats on things, makes it easier for me to develop a theory like that. And then I ask the LLM, anybody ever had this theory before? And I can say, nope, I can't find anybody who's ever said this before. And I can feel a little more reassured that, hey, this is new. And so, I can get it the basic stats about high school changes and the stats about, cultural, big cultural events of modernism and what years they happened and what were the main figures and how old they were. And I can use that to support a more abstract theory like this.
Interesting. And do you have thoughts why high school itself would be so influential compared to, say, college?
Well, college was influential once it appeared too, but high school appeared first. So the point was high school was enough. That is, once you had these strong high school aged people are old enough to support a youth movement. Like 10-year-olds are not, 15-year-olds maybe not even, but 18, 16, 17, 18 to 20, those kids are old enough to actually have an opinion, to organize together, to have strong emotions about what they're doing together, and to create a youth movement and support it across long distances with enough wealth to have free time to pursue it and enough long distance communication to coordinate youth movements all across larger scales. That's, in fact, the best way I'm suggesting we understand the modern world and how it's different from the traditional worlds. Why did all of a sudden culture start changing rapidly and keep changing rapidly? Because of high school and then college.
And before that, youth didn't have a way to get together in the same numbers.
Right. So before that, when you reached, say, finished before high school, you went off into the work world and then you were mixed up with other adults and then you were eager to seem older. So, we just have 16-year-olds going out into the workplace trying to dress and talk like the older workers around them because they wanted to be accepted by the older workers around them. They wanted to seem like they were as good as them and to be in part of them. So youth didn't have a separate youth culture and a separate youth style before high school. And that was the ancient world. Now, of course, large changes like revolutions or wars were often dominated by young people. Younger people were, in fact, the main fodder in war and in civil wars and revolutions, but they less had their own separate culture.
And this idea, besides being able to learn about different topics, was there a way that AI helped you come up with it directly, or it just let you research it much more easily?
More just letting me research it.
Okay, interesting. So even that alone could end up having, even if we stop there and we just make better use of the tools already there, that
Right.
could still cause a lot of rapid improvement in society.
if we could assign the LLMs the task of integrating what they already think they know, that would also potentially compete with what I'm doing. I don't know if it would be as good, but that would be a really big change to the world. But as we talked about in Elephant in the Brain, there's just ways in which people don't actually want to know the truth about things. And I think that will resist this sort of integration. That is, in order to integrate all the things LLM knows, they have to be willing to actually face the facts of whatever those integrations are. And LLMs so far have been trained to and actually practiced at social desirability denies. They do tend to tell you the things people tend to want to hear. I've just noticed that when I ask it about many details, when I happen to have specialized in something where I sort of know the answer isn't the social desirability answer, it doesn't give the right answer. It gives the answer people want to hear.
Right. I mean, it could be because it's seen so much text that follow the social desirable
bias. Yes, of course.
But I wonder if...
Quite plausibly true, yes.
Overall, it might be able to be like less biased than humans because it doesn't have the regular human biases going on. So in cases where it avoids
the training will try to, if the training continues to try to make it, make users happy with it, that training will probably just continue to make it want to say the things people want to hear. But those things are not as coherent. So for example, when I ask it about something I know and it gives me the social desirable answer, and then I point out details inconsistent with that, well, then it caves. But it doesn't remember caving when it has to talk to somebody else. These things don't work that way, right?
Of course, you don't know. It caves often no matter what you say to it. It's sometimes because it's like too nice. Is there something special here because you had more evidence, or would have said that no matter what?
Right. But I think this will be one of the main limitations on LLMs in the coming future, is that they are on things where there are social desirability biases. They are just not very good sources on the abstractions, but they'll be still good on the details. Quite often, the things people want to hear just are not consistent with many details around them. So ask about the details and then use that to think rather than asking for the abstractions.
And since you just touched on culture and just returning to the overall topic we were discussing, so AI has made it much easier to make art, to make music. There are a lot of things that it's done. And kind of an evidence to your overall argument in the Elephant in the Brain, as soon as AI makes it easy to do something, people aren't impressed by it. So any art or music that would have been considered like very impressive a couple of years ago, now it's like, oh, that was AI generated. I don't care. So it does kind of demonstrate, at least on some level, people want to see something that a human does that's impressive, which is very in line with the argument.
Because they want to be impressed by the human. It's less wanting to be impressed by the art per se. I have to admit, I'm very impressed by a lot of the art that AI can create is much better than humans can create, given the time scale they created. I mean, they can put together a video or a picture in a very short time.
Right. I mean, now they could make very photorealistic pictures. Obviously, a human couldn't have done that instantly to make something that just looks completely realistic.
So they're just, in some ways, much better than humans on many kinds of that sort of constructing images and sounds and videos.
Right. And to me, it's also just like, I'm just so impressed by it. Even I feel like a little bit on an ongoing basis, it's just wild that it could do all these things. But what do you think people will focus on when they want to do art and music? Will they like try to do something that's more manual and just to show, like, even if it's not better, just to show how hard it is? Or will they try to make very advanced use of the AI to do something that's hard to do even with AI because of the sophisticated way they pull it together?
Well, as you know, art is separated into high prestige art versus mass art, mass entertainment art. And mass entertainment art will just have to be things that ordinary people can relate to. They will want to see that it's based on humans, but they still will just primarily want the entertainment. Whereas prestige art, it'll be more about the symbols and how it evokes other symbols in the area, et cetera. And that will be judged on a group of people who are accepted as the highbrow judges of those things. It's, hard to say. I think, a fundamental thing about art and culture for a long time is that it's kind of like the stock market, like intrinsically hard to predict because that's its nature. If it were easy to predict, then there were ways people could win at it. And so when people try to do those things to win it by predicting it, that makes it less predictable. So it's just naturally unpredictable. So that's what, say, youth movements predict too. Youth movements in art and youth have been the main drivers of art change over century and also in other kinds of culture. Look, the key dynamic is, say there's been a youth movement going on for 6 years, and now a new generation of youths want to do something different. They want to be the leaders. They don't want to just be followers of the previous movement. They want to have a new movement with them in charge. And so every, 6 years or so, roughly a new generation of youth say, we want a new movement. And then it needs to be something that is different from the previous movement and maybe the previous 5 movements and different from the larger world outside, because they want to reject the larger world and say, no, I don't want to sit and take decades to slowly earn my place in the world. I want to jump to the top right now, and I can do that if I have a new movement. But it needs to be something new that's different from what's out there now. And if it had been predictable, then the previous generation would have already sort of occupied that slot. So it has to just be intrinsically unpredictable.
For true art, I see that that happening, and also humans will be doing something that's unpredictable. Of course, for a lot of practical purposes, which also you were referencing, it could be AI will just take over more and more of it. In terms of if someone needs a marketing ad or something like that, they might be able to use AI to generate it. I don't know about movies because there people still want something impressive, but I guess depending on each case, there'll be different ways in which humans are relevant and some cases where maybe humans aren't as relevant.
Right. So, if you think about, say, home decorations, architecture, things like that, those are slowly changes, but you might think an AI could just do a good job of creating an integrated view of a living room, say, all the furniture and things on the wall and things like that. But a thing we've already known about that for a while is that most homes could just look a lot nicer. They could look like, a hotel lobby, except people want to do it themselves. It's more important for people to sort of have been the author of their home decorations than that they meet high standards of aesthetic approval. And so that'll probably limit how much AI can change those things either. So if you can sit and use an AI to sort of lay out your living room and everything else, and then everybody comes and they praise you, then people might use that more. But same for clothes, for example. If you would let a expert tailor and someone dress you, you would just look sharper. But most people want to be the author of their own clothes.
Okay. I think, we covered a wide range of topics there. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
All right. Nice to talk to you.